We're going to be talking again about German and Czech styles today. Let's go ahead and dive in because I've got a lot of stuff to cover today, a lot of ground. And when we talk about German and Czech beer styles, we have to start by talking about lagers. So the first several beers we're going to talk about today are lager beers. So the distinction between lager and ale. There's a lot of differences in fermentation. It really comes down to the type of yeast that you're using. We covered this earlier. And lager yeast, really the main difference between ales and lagers from a flavor standpoint is that lager yeast doesn't produce fruity, estery aromas. So lager yeast is not a major contributor to the flavor profile of a beer, whereas ale yeast can be. Ale yeast does contribute to the aroma and flavor. So lager yeast really doesn't. Now, for a long time in brewing history, brewers didn't really understand fully the function of yeast. And so there was a lot of mystery behind that. And so the way that lager yeast was discovered and isolated is kind of interesting. And I won't go too much into it, but essentially, lager yeast was inadvertently isolated by German brewers centuries ago before they even really fully understood what lager yeast was or even what yeast was. It was inadvertently isolated through extended aging of beer in cool climates because lager yeast is a cool fermenting yeast. And so ale yeast doesn't really work at those cool lager fermentation temperatures. So this long aging of beer in cold caves and the fact that brewing is a wintertime activity. And so those cold winters in Germany combined with that long cold storage inadvertently isolated lager yeast. And so Germans were able to start using this yeast long before other countries were. And so they were really the first ones to make these lager beers. And so the first beers I want to talk about in these German lagers are the Munich Dunkel and the Munich Helles. But before I get too into those beers, I want to talk a little bit about one other ingredient besides yeast. So lager yeast plays a big role in this, but I think it's helpful to understand a little bit about malt. And I want to make a couple of basic distinctions in how we talk about malt. We had a whole section about malt earlier on. If you missed that section earlier, you can go to our YouTube channel and find the recording of that and do a little refresh on that. But I want to talk about specifically the difference between base malt and barley malt to start. So we can talk about malt in those two senses. Base malt is malt that still has all of the starches that can be converted to sugar in the mashing process. So that means that we can make beer out of this. It has the ability to make beer. Specialty malt, on the other hand, has undergone processes in the malting process that changes or damages those starches. So we do not have the ability to create fermentable sugars with specialty malt anymore. So the difference between base malt and specialty malt is really that base malt, we can still make beer with it. The starches are intact. And with specialty malt, we can't make beer with 100% specialty malt. So specialty malt is used primarily for adding color and flavor to the beer in addition to a base malt. So we can take 100% base malt and make a beer with it. We can't take 100% specialty malt and make beer with it. So I'm making that distinction because I want to talk specifically about a couple of different types of base malt. So when we talk about base malt, we have a range of color and flavor development within the world of base malt. At the very lightest end, that's lightly toasted and has very little color development, and that has a very distinct flavor to it, is Pilsner malt. That's the lightest roast of malt that you can get in base malt. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got more heat applied in the kilning process or the malting process, and we have more color developed and more flavor developed in that process. And it's at the upper end of the spectrum of what you can get with color and flavor development while still having it be base malt. And that malt is Munich malt. So at the two ends of the color and flavor spectrum for base malt, we have Pilsner malt at the light end and Munich malt at the dark end. And when we talk about, and so that's the color distinction, and these have different flavors that come with that malting as well. So Pilsner malt features flavors that are more like white bread or water cracker, whereas Munich malt features more flavors that are more like toast or like bread crust. So getting back to the styles that I wanted to talk about with originally, the Munich Dunkel and the Munich Helles are really great examples of what those individual malts will contribute to a beer. So let's look a little closer at Munich Dunkel to start. First of all, to understand some of these German styles, it's important to understand some basic German vocabulary words. And when we talk about a Munich Dunkel, Dunkel in German is the word for dark in German. So Dunkel means dark. So the Munich Dunkel was historically the everyday beer of Bavaria in southern Germany. This is what people drank all the time in Bavaria. And the makeup of this beer is unique in the sense that it is really kind of a showpiece or a nearly pure expression of Munich malt and the flavors associated with Munich malt. So it has very little hop aroma and flavor in the beer. It has very low bitterness. It uses lager yeast, which doesn't contribute to aroma and flavor in the beer in any significant way. So without all of those characteristics, the only thing that's left is your malt flavor. And many of these Munich Dunkels are made with 100% Munich malt. And even if they're not, that's the featured malt. That's the primary malt that's used in these beers. So it's really, it features those flavors. So you're going to get kind of a toasty or bread crust malt flavor from it. And then if you look at Munich Helles, it was a more recent development. So Munich Dunkel really kind of dominated the Munich and the Bavarian beer scene for a really long time. But around in the mid 1800s, Pilsner beer, which we're going to talk about in a minute, Pilsner beer was sweeping across Europe and was incredibly popular. And a lot of people were making their versions of Pilsner beer, this golden lager beer. They're making their versions of it all over Europe. And a lot of them were coming out of Germany because of their long history of brewing with lager yeast. So the northern Germans were making these Pilsner beers, but there was some resistance to this in southern Germany because for a number of different reasons. Part of it was a water chemistry issue that made it more difficult to make pale lagers. Another one was just resistance on behalf of the Bavarian brewers who felt a very close association with making these dark lagers. In any event, it wasn't until the late 1800s when some of these Bavarian brewers really started to get into making a pale lager beer. And when they decided to make a pale lager beer to compete with all of the Pilsners that were around at that time, they made it in their own way. So a Pilsner beer, like we'll talk about, features a nice hop bitterness, a very distinct hop bitterness. Whereas a Helles, the Munich Helles, which is the light lager or the pale lager that the Munich brewers and the Bavarian brewers made, it doesn't feature that sharp bitterness that a Pilsner does. So what you end up with a Munich Helles is a beer that shares a lot of descriptors with the Munich Dunkel in a way, because a Munich Helles has no hop aroma and flavor really to speak of, very low bitterness. It has no fermentation aroma and flavor because of the use of lager yeast. All of those things are the same as with Munich Dunkel, except the Munich Helles is based on Pilsner malt instead of Munich malt. And so the Pilsner malt being lighter lighter in color is going to give you a lighter beer, and it's going to come with its own flavor set. So we've got flavors that are more white bread or water cracker. And so the Munich Helles is almost that pure expression of Pilsner malt. And that's the really neat thing about Munich Helles and Munich Dunkel. And Munich Helles, by the way, means light in German. So you could kind of see that now. We've got the Munich Helles at the light end of the spectrum, uh, featuring the aromas and flavors of that lightest base malt, Pilsner malt. And then you have the Munich Dunkel, which is at the darker end of the spectrum, using that base malt that's at the darker end of that base malt spectrum, and that's featuring its own set of flavors. So, so that's a little bit about the some malty German lagers, the Munich Helles and the Munich Dunkel. I want to move on to some other lager beers which are very significant in that region, and that is the Pilsner beers. So when we talk about Pilsner beer, we have to talk about where Pilsner beer originated from. So Pilsner beer, the original Pilsner beer, is a beer that today we call Czech Premium Pale Lager. That's what the Beer Judge Certification Program, or BJCP, calls uh, calls these beers. So this is a beer that BJCP used to call Bohemian Pils. So you may have heard that term before. And a lot of breweries who make beers like this refer to them as a Czech Pils. So Bohemian Pils, Czech Pils are kind of common terms used. The BJCP term, for those of you who are studying for Cicerone exam, is Czech Premium Pale Lager. So this beer is really the grandfather of Pilsner beer. All Pilsner beers are descended from this original Pilsner beer. So in 1842, in the town of Pilsen, they rebuilt, and they had rebuilt their local brewery, and there had been lots of dissatisfaction with the quality of the beer previous to this. There were protests in the street. People were dumping beer in the street, and so the town officials paid attention, and they built a new brewery, and they opened in 1842 and started brewing a unique type of beer. They brought in a brewer named Joseph Groll, and he developed a recipe that used local ingredients. One was a relatively newly available golden malt. This is what we today would recognize as being Pilsner malt. He also used local hops, specifically Saaz hops. Saaz is one of the noble hops, and it has kind of a flowery, spicy aroma and flavor. The other distinctive ingredient he used was lager yeast. He brought lager yeast in from Germany. And so using these three unique ingredients, he created a unique beer that is really the first Pilsner beer. Pilsner literally means from Pilsen. So this is a beer that was golden in color, had a very distinctive bitterness, and a nice full rounded malt flavor that featured those Pilsner malt flavors like water cracker, white bread. So that original Pilsner beer was called Pilsner Urquell. This is a beer that you can still get today. It's still widely available. So there's other types of beer. There's other Czech premium pale lagers that are available out there. Some from the Czech Republic would be Staropramen or Czech Bar. Another domestic one is Oscar Blues Mama's Little Yellow Pills. Some good examples of the style there. In any event, this beer became incredibly popular. It became popular in the town of Pilsen, and it became popular outside of Pilsen too. And before they knew it, brewers were imitating this beer all over the place. And the first brewers to really imitate this beer and were really the northern German brewers. They were already working with lager yeast, so it wasn't that new of a concept, lager brewing. And there wasn't as much resistance to making a pale lager beer in northern Germany as there was in southern Germany. So these northern German brewers started to make their interpretation of this Czech beer. But there were a few things that ended up different. One of the main differences is that the water content was quite different in northern Germany, because you see the water content in the town of Pilsen was very soft, had very low mineral content, whereas the northern German brewing water had a lot of minerals in it, and so this changed the beer. So the German Pils, as we call it now, is a beer that is a little bit lighter in body than the original Czech version. It's also a little bit paler in color, and it has a sharper perceived bitterness. So that bitterness stands out a little bit more. Although the IBUs, the measured IBUs, or the range that BJCP outlines, is roughly the same for German Pils as it is for Czech Premium Pale Lager. Although the perception of that bitterness comes through a little bit more in the German Pils, because the beer is a little bit lighter embodied and a little bit drier. Another difference between those two styles is that the Czech version may have, and commonly does have, a very low level of diacetyl in it. Diacetyl is a compound that tastes and smells like butter or buttered popcorn. In many contexts in beer, and in most contexts in beer, it's not a desirable characteristic. But there are some beer styles where a low level is acceptable and very commonly found. And so that's the case with Czech Premium Pale Lager. In fact, Pilsner Urquell does have a low level of diacetyl, which many people enjoy quite a bit. So these beers were really the forefathers of all the modern Pilsners we see, including Bud Miller Coors and American Lager Beer, the International Pale Lagers. And we'll talk a little bit more about those next week when we get into American beers. But really, one of the big features of these beers is that hop bitterness. That's one of the things I like to emphasize, because a lot of people's modern understanding of Pilsner beer comes from these kind of descendants of the Pilsner beer, the American lager beer, which doesn't really have a distinct hop bitterness. But the German Pils and the Czech Premium Pale Lager do feature a nice distinctive hop bitterness, in addition to that Pilsner malt characteristic, that white bread, water cracker like malt flavor. So that's a little bit about the lager beers: Munich Dunkel, Munich Helles, the Czech Premium Pale Lager, and the German Pils. And now I want to talk a little bit about some ales. So German ales in particular, and specifically German wheat beer. So again, I want to take a second and explain a couple of basic German vocabulary words. So we're going to talk about German wheat beer, which is known as Weissbier, Weiss. Weiss in German means white. White is a term that's used quite commonly in Germany and in Belgium, for that matter, to describe a wheat beer. So there's that association there. And wheat beers, wheat has a lot of protein in it, and it lends itself to making hazy beers. And in certain contexts, with certain percentage of wheat, and depending on the brewer and how it's brewed, there could be enough haze in that beer where the beer could potentially even appear somewhat white. That's the association a lot of people make with those. So a white beer is a term used to refer to wheat beers. So the German Weissbier is a beer that has 2/3 wheat malt, with the balance being Pilsner malt. So it features a whole lot of wheat, and the wheat is going to give it a little bit different malt character. The wheat is going to give it a more kind of bread flour kind of characteristic, whereas the Pilsner malt by itself is going to be more bread-like. It's a very subtle distinction, but that kind of flowery character is one of the characteristics you can expect from a beer that uses a large percentage of wheat. But the real hallmark of the flavor of a German Weiss beer comes from fermentation. Because remember, ale yeast produces esters, these fruity aromas. And then some ale yeast, as we talked about the other day, some ale yeast can produce what we call phenols, these spicy aromatics. And German Weiss beer features some of both of those, specifically an ester that smells like bananas and a phenol that smells like cloves. So banana and clove are going to be the feature aromas. Now, it doesn't have bananas and cloves in it. These are all compounds produced through fermentation that smell like those things, right? So the hallmark of the aroma and flavor of a German Weiss beer is that banana clove characteristic. So there are several different versions of this German Weiss beer. That standard Weiss beer has, again, the 2/3 wheat malt with the balanced Pilsner malt. There's a darker version called a Dunkelweizen. And then there's an unfiltered version of the standard German Weiss beer called a Hefeweizen. So a couple more German vocabulary words there. So I talked about Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, meaning white. Well, sometimes the term Weizen is used. That's W-E-I-Z-E-N. Weizen means wheat in German. So these terms can be used somewhat interchangeably. So there's the Hefeweizen, the wheat beer with yeast. Hefe means yeast. So Hefeweizen is literally yeast wheat. This is an unfiltered German Weiss beer. And then there's the Dunkelweizen. The Dunkelweizen is similar to the Hefeweizen, only it has, instead of a balance of Pilsner malt, it typically has a balance of Munich malt in it, which makes it a little bit darker and gives it a little bit different malt flavor that comes from Munich malt, a little more toasty, maybe bread crust-like, but it still features those banana clove aromas. Because again, this is the hallmark of all of the different Weiss beers. So I want to move on now to a couple of other wheat beers, which are quite common nowadays. One is the Berliner Weiss. Berliner Weiss is a very unique beer. So this is a beer that originated in Berlin, no surprise based on the name. Berliner Weiss is a very low alcohol wheat beer from Berlin. Uses about 50% wheat, and it's very low alcoholic strength. It's about 2.8 to 3.8 ABV. And what's unique about this beer is that it undergoes a lactobacillus fermentation. So if you remember when we talked about fermentation several sessions ago, we talked a little bit about souring bacteria. Lactobacillus is one of those. So that lactobacillus fermentation produces lactic acid, which makes the beer sour. So this is real distinctive characteristic of a Berliner Weiss. So it's low ABV, it's sour, it's quite acidic, and it also is very, very highly carbonated. Traditionally, this beer would be served, or at least offered, at the point of dispense with a sweet syrup added to the glass. So the traditional additions would be flavored either raspberry, which is red, or woodruff, which would be a green syrup, which is kind of more of an herbal syrup. So those would be traditionally offered with a Berliner Weiss. So this was a style that you didn't really see a whole lot of versions of until, maybe 10 years ago, if even that long, when American craft brewers started to rediscover this style of beer and make their own versions of it. And so this fruit addition that was added at the point of dispense is some of the source behind a lot of American brewers making fruited versions of this. So they're adding that kind of that sweet fruit flavoring before packaging. So that sweetness and the fruitiness helps to balance out some of the acidity in that beer. So there's one other wheat beer that I want to talk about. It's also a sour ale, and this is a Goza. This is another beer that until recent years was not really commonly found. This is also a relatively low alcohol wheat beer from Germany. It originated in the town of Goslar, which is where the name comes from, but it was popularized in the city of Leipzig. Uh, it is low alcohol, but not quite as low as the Berliner Weiss. So this is about 4.2 to 4.8 ABV. And this also, like the Berliner Weiss, undergoes a lactobacillus fermentation, which makes it sour. It's also highly carbonated, but the main difference here is that a Goza is made with salt and coriander, which gives it a very distinctive flavor. And the salt is a very unique addition. There's really no other style of beer out there that utilizes salt like this, where it adds a whole other element of balance to the beer. And salt, much like the way it's used in food, can, if it's used in the right proportion, can kind of wake up all of the other flavors in the beer. So that gets me to the end of the basics of what I wanted to cover. We've got the wheat beers and the lagers. And now I want to I want to answer some questions, but I want to remind you that we are now posting the survey that if you fill it out, you will be entered to win a free certified beer server exam. There it is in the chat right there. So click on that and fill it out, enter to win. Please don't enter if you have either already passed certified beer server or if you're one of the past winners. But if you haven't won in the past and you haven't passed certified beer server, click on that link. You have until 3 o'clock Central Time to click on it. So you got about an hour and a half. When this video is done, we're gonna post it on our YouTube page, on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch the recorded version of this. And that link will still be live in the description of this video until 3 o'clock. So for about another hour and a half. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me get to some of these questions. All right, got several here. One is let's see here. So the diacetyl in beer depends on the water. Well, no. When I was talking about the difference between the Czech Premium Pale Lager and the German Pils, the differences that arose from the water content have to do more with how the malt and the hops express themselves. So the malt character ends up not being as full or rounded. It ends up coming across as being a little drier, and the hops are a little bit sharper. So those are the differences and some of the main differences between those beers stylistically. One of the other differences is the diacetyl content in some of the Czech Premium Pale Lager. Although that's not, the diacetyl is not found in every single Czech Premium Pale Lager. And it's not the result of mineral content in the water. Diacetyl in this instance comes from fermentation. It's naturally produced during fermentation in all beers. And then in the maturation phase of fermentation, yeast will clean up that diacetyl. But in some beers, the yeast doesn't really clean up all of the diacetyl. And Czech Premium Pale Lager, many of those don't have yeast that fully clean up all that diacetyl. So those are coming from separate sources. Next question. Let's see. We've got, was there a reason different synonyms of Weissbier, Weizen, Hefeweizen, are used in different areas of Germany or by different breweries? Well, so there is a there's really common nomenclature used. So Weissbier is kind of the general description that encompasses a couple of different types of German wheat beer. It includes a Hefeweizen, which is the unfiltered version. It includes an unfiltered version as well called Kristallweizen. Um, and then and then there's Dunkelweizen, which isn't, doesn't really fall under Weiss beer particularly, because it's not white per se. But really, Weiss beer and Weizen uh, are sometimes used interchangeably, but it's not really so much a regional difference. You're going to find Weissbier used as more of a blanket term, and you're going to see Weizen used in more specific ones like Hefeweizen and Kristallweizen, or in a Weizenbock, which is a stronger version of it. I hope that clears it up. The description clove as an aroma. What are some examples of this aroma for the not native English? Name some foods that have cloves. Um, so so clove aroma, many people would describe it as being kind of spicy. Um, and I'm kind of drawing a blank on foods that have cloves in them by the way right now. Um, but it's not it's if you're not familiar with clove, it's more one of those things where you might need to make your own association with that spicy character that comes from the beer. See, a lot of flavor and aroma perception and being able to assign uh, a descriptor or a term to it has to come from something that you're familiar with. So if you don't know what cloves are, I'm going to have a hard time explaining to you what they are. I can use some other terms like spicy, and that can kind of get you there. But uh, the best thing for you to do is to taste that beer and smell it and pick out the banana and then pick out that other spicy character and see if there's another descriptor that you could use that would help out. So some other common phenols that can mingle in there would be like a white pepper potentially, although that is slightly different. Um, is the ale yeast on Weissbier or Weizen a special one? Can I have a beer with wheat but with standard ale yeast? That's a great question. So yes, it is a special yeast that produces those high levels of that banana aroma and that clove aroma. Um, so if you made the same beer with a standard American ale yeast that didn't produce large levels of those aromas, essentially what you would end up with is an American wheat ale, which is another style that we'll probably talk about in American styles next week. So that's one of the keys to understanding wheat beers is knowing the difference between American wheat ale, which doesn't have that banana clove character, and the German wheat beers, which do. How do American brewers make Pilsners with their water to match Czech or German flavor? So modern brewers have the ability to do whatever they want with the water now. They can strip out all of the mineral content and add back whatever minerals they want to mimic the characteristic water styles of different regions. This is a very common thing done in professional brewing. So there's lots of different ways they can do that. Reverse osmosis is a great way to help separate out uh, minerals from the water, and then you can just add back whatever you need. Is Berliner Weiss different from Lambic styles? Yes, it is. So Berliner Weiss, as it's produced nowadays, undergoes a specific lactobacillus fermentation. And then after that lactobacillus fermentation, it undergoes a more traditional fermentation with Saccharomyces yeast. So the lactobacillus fermentation produces lactic acid, and then the Saccharomyces fermentation, the traditional fermentation, that produces the alcohol. Lambic production is spontaneous production. We'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about Belgian beers next week. But the spontaneous fermentation means that we're not pitching any intentional bacteria or yeast into the wort to induce fermentation. We're allowing the wild yeast and bacteria floating around in the air to get into the wort, and that's where the fermentation starts. And so because of that, you end up with a much more complex and deep aroma from fermentation with Lambic beer than you do with other beers like Berliner Weiss. Let's see, does Goza beer have clove and banana flavors from the wheat? No, wheat does not produce the clove and banana flavors. The clove and banana flavors are products of fermentation. Those come from the yeast. So a Goza is not going to have those in there. Now, anytime you're using ale yeast, there's the potential to have low levels of banana ester, for example, but nowhere near what you should expect from a German Weiss beer. So Goza does not use that particular strain of yeast that produces that banana clove. They both used wheat, but the wheat is not the source of those aromas. Did you say the Weiss beers were ales? Yes, they are ales. They use ale yeast. And the biggest giveaway for whether they're ales or lagers is that the hallmark flavor, aroma and flavor, is that banana clove character from fermentation. Ale yeast produces those. Lager yeast wouldn't produce large levels of banana and clove. When does the lactobacillus get added in the brewing process? So modern brewers, as they're making this now, a lot of them are doing what they call a kettle sour, which is inducing a lactobacillus fermentation in the kettle. There's some historical methods that would sour the beer at different stages. A lot of what you're going to see from modern American brewers are that kettle sour, but there's a number of different places where you could introduce that lactobacillus, and traditionally that was likely done in the fermenter. Is Goza also a wheat beer with 50% wheat malt? Yes, it is. Short and sweet. In terms of sour beers, does sour tart acidity mean the same thing? Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, they're referring to that same characteristic. And depending on who you talk to, those terms may be used slightly differently. I think when people think of the term sour, they're thinking of something that is a lot more sour than something that someone is describing as being tart. Although that's gonna vary depending on who's actually speaking. Acidity, I understand acidity is more of a blanket term that covers, basically anything that's sour on your tongue, any range of that. But again, there's a lot of squishiness with those terms there. Let's see. The CBS syllabus includes a couple more styles in these categories, such as Box and Kolsch. Should we also study for these styles? Study those styles for the exam? Yes, you should. Uh, we in these short sessions, we don't have the time to cover every single style that you're responsible for. I'm hitting on some highlights though. Your source for what you need to know to study for the certified beer server exam, that source for studying is the certified beer server syllabus. The syllabus is available on our website, and that will tell you every style that you're responsible for knowing out of the BJCP style guidelines. So study off of that list. I am not covering every single style that you're responsible for on the CBS exam. Let's see. What is the difference between wheat beer hazy and a New England IPA hazy without wheat? Well, so the similarities are really just that they have a haze. And that's, other than that, they're totally different beers. Um, so a Hefeweizen, for example, like we talked about, German Hefeweizen uh, is a pale beer that's hazy, but it features big aromas of banana and clove, like we talked about, and has a low bitterness. New England IPA, being an IPA, features a lot more hops, big hop aromatics, and a decent amount of bitterness. So the flavor profiles are totally different. Really, the only similarities there is that they're hazy. Is there a historical relationship between Goza and Goose? Um, you know, I would say probably not. I Somebody may be able to draw a link between those two at some point, but these are different brewing traditions. Gueuze is a style of lambic that has spontaneous fermentation, and a Goza comes from this tiny town in Germany. Uh, for more information on Gueuze, Pat Fahey, Master Cicerone Pat Fahey, did a tasting together session on Gueuze, and you can find out more information about that on the YouTube channel. Pull up that session. Can you expand a little on Märzen beers? So Märzen beers are very similar to the Munich Dunkel. They're a little bit stronger, but they're still based primarily in Munich malt. And the difference is really that they're using more malt, so you end up with more alcohol. And because you're using more malt, you're not only getting more alcohol, but you're getting more malt flavor, and you're extracting more of those flavor compounds. Um, it's called a Märzen because März means March. And this was a stronger beer that was associated with the end of the traditional brewing season. Brewing historically is a wintertime activity. So there are several styles of beer that are associated with the end of the brewing season. Oftentimes these beers were a little bit stronger, and Märzen was one of those beers. Märzen is a beer that ultimately evolved into essentially what we understand today as being Oktoberfest. Does the diacetyl level stay the same as the beer ages? Uh, yeah, I would expect diacetyl levels to stay the same. Is it true that decoction creates this unique taste for Czech Pilsners? Uh, I would say the short answer for that is yes. Czech brewers insist that that an essential part of the flavor profile of their beers comes from decoction mashing. Now, I realize I'm using a term that not a lot of people understand. Decoction mashing is a way of is a method of mashing whereby you change the temperature of the mash by removing part of it, bringing it to a boil, and then returning it to the mash, and that raises the overall temperature of the mash. Uh, the There are a number of things that happen with that. Uh, but one of the things is that you get a fuller, richer malt flavor. And so Czech brewers will insist that that decoction is a critical part of the production of those beers. What about Kolsch? Where does that fit in German lagers? Kolsch beer is a beer made with Kolsch. It comes from Cologne. Köln is the German name for Cologne, so that literally means from Cologne. The only place you'll find a Kolsch beer in Germany is in Cologne. And it is a beer that shares a lot of similarities with Pilsner as far as its construction, but the main difference is that it uses ale yeast, although they ferment it at a cooler temperature than they typically do with most ales. So you end up with a light estery component to it, but it's very similar to a Pilsner in a lot of ways. If you want to learn more about Kolsch beer, Master Cicerone Pat Fahey has you covered again. You can go to the YouTube channel, our YouTube channel, Cicerone YouTube channel, and find his tasting together session on Kolsch and learn more about it there. Let's see. Isn't Bock a German lager style? Yes, it is. So Bock beer is Bock's in general. There are several different types of Bock beers. Bock beers are strong German lagers. So they have a minimum ABV of 6.3%. 6.3% and above for lager beers are all fall into the category of Bock beer. So there's Helles Bock, which is based in has the Pilsner malt base. Then there's Dunkle Bock, which has a Munich malt base, and then there's Doppelbock, which is an even stronger lager beer. Doppelbock is also a topic that Master Cicerone Pat Fahey covered in his Tasting Together series. I feel like in the next few days talking styles, I'm going to be making a lot of references to Pat's Tasting Together series. So to learn more about German beers in general, we have the German Beer Styles Road to Cicerone book that you can find on the Cicerone website. It is one of a series of books we've created that focus on a particular area of study. This book, if you purchase the book at the website, it comes with a specialist exam. So this is a nice kind of stepping stone between certified beer server exam and certified Cicerone exam. And if you purchase the book and you pass the exam, you'll receive a little lapel pin that designates you as a specialist in German beer styles. So check that out at cicerone.org. All right, that gets me to the end of the Q&A session. If you want to, this is going to be posted. The recording of this is going to be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, check it out there. If you want to watch previous ones, all of them are posted there right now. Make a point to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's all kinds of other cool content on there, including Master Cicerone Pat Fahey's Tasting Together series. So I want to let you know that his next session is tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central Time. This week, he is discussing Rauch beer, a very exciting topic. I love Rauch beer. So join me Thursday, May 21st for CBS Prep Talk number 10, British and Irish beer styles. So until then, cheers, everybody. Thank you for showing up. We'll see you in a couple days.